I asked you whether or not you are the head of the Mafia organization in the Tampa, Florida area.
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that the answer may tend to incriminate me in violation of my constitutional rights.
Are you, Mr. Trafficante, a member of what is known as the Mafia, either here or in any other state or city in the United States?
Mr. Chairman, we can't continue under these conditions, in this atmosphere.
When Senator Estes Kefauver came on the scene, he didn't just make headlines. He declared war. He went city to city, dragging mobsters into the light, sometimes in handcuffs, sometimes under subpoena. He wanted to show America the machinery of organized crime, and in Tampa, his spotlight landed on one family, the Trafficantes. The old man, Santo Sr., was already a name whispered with respect in Havana back in the 1940s. Even Lucky Luciano acknowledged him. He was quiet, calculating, untouchable. While others shouted in smoke-filled rooms, Santo Sr. would sit silent, watching. When the crowd thinned and only the bosses were left, then he'd speak. And when he did, everyone listened. His son, Santo Trafficante Jr., was different, younger, sharper, but he carried the same cold discipline. If there were 13 big players in the country, Santo Jr. only dealt with the top 10. In his world, tribute wasn't optional. It was the price of doing business. His empire stretched from Tampa to Havana, tied tight with the Chicago outfit, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and the far-right Cuban exiles plotting Castro's overthrow from Miami safehouses. One of his men, John Martino, ran operations in Cuba until Castro locked Santo Jr. up in 1959. Even then, it was temporary. Castro released him, and back in the States, Trafficante walked free. No U.S. prosecutor could touch him. He never served real time. He was too careful, too smart, too protected. By the early 50s, the Kefauver hearings made his name public. On January 4, 1951, Committee Counsel Downey Rice announced a list of fugitives wanted for questioning. Red Italiano, the Diesidio brothers, Augustine Frisia, and both Santo Sr. and Jr. They were tied to the murder of gambling fixer Jimmy Velasco and the numbers racket that greased Tampa's underworld. The subpoenas went out, but the witnesses vanished. When the hearings resumed, Kefauver's investigators traced Tampa rackets into a national web. A Treasury narcotics agent, Claude Folmer, testified that Mafia heroin pipelines from Marseille ran through Havana and Tampa before flooding Chicago, Kansas City, and the West Coast. He told stories of shotgun murders, kids gunned down, cops executed, witnesses silenced. He named the Antinori brothers of Tampa, a family that had already lost its patriarch to a Mafia blast, and tied their drug connections directly to Trafficante's circle. Wiretaps caught Tampa mobsters complaining they couldn't make a dime without paying off the sheriff, the city, and the mayor. The corruption was that deep. The committee couldn't even get its witnesses into the room. As Kefauver left town, the local mob stayed underground, untouched. By 1954, civic leaders were boiling over. Ralph Mills of the Hillsborough County Crime Commission called Tampa a paradox, a town of decent citizens living under the thumb of a ruthless little band of racketeers. He named names: Red Italiano, the Diesidios, Santo Jr. They had been subpoenaed, he said, but they ran like a pack of rats when the committee arrived. Mills declared a new war on organized crime, but he knew what he was up against. Local law enforcement wasn't helping. Justice, when it came, was slow and often rigged. Meanwhile, Santo Jr. kept moving. He strengthened ties with Marcello and the outfit, and his men worked with Cuban exiles plotting Castro's downfall. Johnny Roselli, Chicago's man in Hollywood, later told people Trafficante's name came up in talk about Kennedy's assassination. When Roselli's body turned up, hacked and stuffed in a barrel, floating in Miami waters, It was a message. The Trafficantes didn't tolerate loose talk. Through it all, Santo Jr. remained untouchable. His empire ran on silence, discipline, and fear. From 1951 forward, his name was no longer just whispered in Havana casinos or Tampa bolita parlors. It was in Senate hearings, in FBI files, and splashed across front pages. Santo Trafficante Jr. had stepped out of the shadows, and law enforcement finally understood this was the man in charge. May 1951, the headlines turned hard. The fight wasn't just Tampa versus the Trafficantes anymore. The map widened, Tallahassee to Miami, Tampa to Fort Lauderdale, linking bookies, bolita bankers, and public office. And every thread still pointed back to the quiet center of gravity, the Trafficante name. A House crime committee started peeling the cover off the State House. Testimony landed like charges. Raymond Craig, Miami gambling boss with dirty edges, told investigators that William Bill Johnston had cleared administration support for a 1949 off-track betting bill. Johnston owned Florida dog tracks and had been one of the big three donors to Governor Fuller Warren's 1948 campaign. Craig said he'd been steered from Tallahassee to Johnston in Chicago for the green light. He claimed trips to the law office of B.K. Roberts, Warren's friend and future Supreme Court Justice, before flying north with Miami lawyer Al Hubbard to see Johnston at Sportsman's Park in Cicero. Roberts pushed back. He remembered Hubbard once on a bond matter, not Craig. His secretary checked the books and found no Craig visits. Ralph Mills, ex-Kefauver investigator, now running the Hillsborough County Crime Commission, put a number on the rot. As many as 2,000 gambling racketeers operated in Tampa under Sheriff Hugh Culbreth, he said. The rackets endured with the connivance of law enforcement. His bottom line, nobody ever goes to jail for gambling in Tampa. Mills called Salvatore Red Italiano and 71-year-old Charlie Wall the two top figures on Florida's west coast. Wall, he said, was the most sinister presence the city ever produced. Italiano ran the Sicilian-dominated syndicate. He reminded the committee that when the Senate boys came to town, the key witnesses, Italiano, Lumia, Lazara, others, dodged subpoenas and vanished. Mills didn't stop at the gambling charts. He put names and habits on the table. Culbreth, visiting known racketeers, soliciting their votes, deputies fraternizing with the same men they were supposed to lock up. He flagged the sheriff's unexplained money, multiple accounts, and a net worth that jumped from around 30,000 to north of 100,000 on a public salary. He urged the House to keep digging into Culbreth, into the sheriff's brother allegedly booking bets inside the county jail, into the wider web binding Tampa's gamblers to officials sworn to police them. Reinstating Culbreth, Mills said, would be a mistake the county would pay for. Then the Senate Crime Committee dropped its year-end report on May 1st. It accused Governor Fuller Warren of letting the power of his office serve syndicate interests, specifically the Chicago Capone crowd muscling into Miami Beach through the S&G operation. It condemned Warren's reinstatement of Dade's smiling Jimmy Sullivan without a full public airing. Warren offered no comment. On Tampa, the senators didn't split hairs. Law enforcement had failed to control violence tied to organized gambling. The hearings played out against a long slate of murders and attempted hits. More than a dozen dead, 6 near misses in roughly 2 decades, almost all unsolved. The committee said the pattern in Tampa matched what it saw across the country. Entrenched gambling money corrupting public office. It called out bolita as the city's engine. Tampa didn't carve strict turf like other cities. Bankers worked the whole territory with fixed crews of pickup men and assigned sales points. That system still bled. The 2 most recent killings, Jimmy Velasco in 1948, Jimmy Lumia in 1950, were bolita figures. No convictions. The Mafia's hand, the report said, showed in the witness fear and the interstate ties. Those ties weren't theoretical. In Los Angeles, cops searching Jack Dragner, West Coast boss, found the telephone numbers of Santo Trafficante Sr. and the late Lumia. In Tampa, police files went missing like bodies. Chief Beasley, 5 months into the job, told senators flat out, on many murders there were no files. On others, the paperwork was tissue thin. Accident, negligence, or design? He couldn't say. One missing file involved George Saturday Zarate, shot at 8th and 14th in 1936 by 2 men with sawed-off shotguns, then ambushed again at his home on Nebraska Avenue. Zarate had been picked up in New York as a narcotics suspect tied to Lucky Luciano. The only gangland conviction Tampa could boast in 20 years was his brother, Mario, who drew life in 1932 for the murder of produce dealer Armando Valdez, and that file was gone too. Another casualty on the list, Joe Vaglicio, killed outside his sandwich stand on July 29, 1937. No arrests. Cops chalked it to an internal mafia war. His name had surfaced in a Cleveland Mafia meeting back in 1928. The New Orleans line showed up as well. The shotgun used to kill Ignacio Antinori in 1940, traced to a Crescent City store, bought by a ghost calling himself John Adams. Antinori had feuded for years with the Tampa gambling combine. His sons later surfaced in narcotics cases, the same pipeline other federal witnesses tied back to Marseille and Havana. Beasley didn't dance around the bigger question. Is there a mafia? I absolutely do, he said. Sicilian-rooted, politically connected, far-reaching. The numbers backed up the paralysis. From January 1st to September 1st, 1950, Tampa made 96 gambling arrests. Not one defendant went to jail. 45 forfeited bond. 43 saw charges dismissed. 6 paid fines. 2 cases lingered. As for Charlie Wall, 3 attempts on his life over 14 years. He sat before the committee and played dumb about who wanted him dead. The senators weren't buying. Illegal gambling, they wrote, cannot operate without police protection. In Tampa, that meant Sheriff Culbreth, State Attorney Rex Farrier, and retired Police Chief Eddings in the center of the web. After testifying, Culbreth took an indictment from a Hillsborough grand jury, bribery and misconduct. Most counts later fell away, but the committee didn't like his answers about the money, the land deals, or his ties to Red Italiano. None of it read clean. Through all of this, the Trafficante presence stayed steady. The Senate named Santo Sr. a long-time mafia leader in Tampa. Dragner's book had his number. The House and Senate built the scaffolding. Politics greasing gambling, gambling funding politics, records vanishing, witnesses scared quiet. That's the ecosystem Santo Trafficante Jr. grew into and learned to control. While officials argued procedure and memory, Santo Jr. watched, patient, and moved only when the room emptied, and the bosses were listening. The spotlight had widened in May 1951, but in the shadows, the man who mattered most was still writing the rules. May 1st, 1951, Washington drew a map for war. The Senate Crime Committee dropped a thick report, 39 moves to choke off organized crime, and told the country the first responsibility sat with the states. Do your own house cleaning, run grand juries where gambling runs wide open, build racket squads, stop the buck passing between police and prosecutors, hit offenders with real time, yank liquor and business licenses from places that front for the action. Put citizens' crime commissions in every big city to keep score and keep pressure. For the feds, the plan was muscle and paperwork. Keep the committee alive long enough to police the interstate angles. Stand up a Justice Department rackets unit. Create a small federal crime commission to ride herd after the hearings end. Make Treasury keep a constant watch on the tax returns of known racketeers. Force clean books on gamblers, on casinos, on anyone running cash rackets. No more writing off betting losses. Regulate, then cut off the telegraphed lifeblood of bookmaking, the wire. Outlaw the shipment of punchboards and roulette wheels across state lines. Toughen narcotics penalties. Tighten immigration and deportation. Pay federal agents enough to keep them honest. Strengthen perjury laws and give prosecutors tools, immunity, enforceable subpoenas, to force testimony. Close the door on mob money in the liquor business and make the Interstate Commerce Commission judge an applicant's moral fitness before licensing interstate carriers. The same day, the committee released the wider bill of particulars. Rackets and their political protectors had grown so large they threatened the American way of life. Names were printed in bold. William O'Dwyer, the ex-New York mayor turned ambassador to Mexico, was called out for letting gambling, narcotics, and waterfront murder flourish on his watch. The Prime Minister, Frank Costello, still held a sinister pull over Tammany Hall. The report read like a ledger of fix and favor from New York to Chicago to Miami. Monopolies dressed up as businesses, taxes dodged by the ton, investigations stalled by the people paid to run them. Western Union took heat for letting its leased lines carry racing results to bookmakers. The Continental Press Service was tagged as the indispensable link, public enemy gear powering the Chicago outfit's profit share in bookmaking from coast to coast. There was one dissent. Senator Wiley didn't want a permanent federal crime commission that might drift toward a national police force. But on the rest, the senators were aligned. Cut the wire, cut the cash, cut the cover. Florida, Tampa most of all, sat heavy in the subtext. Bolita was the engine. The murders tied to it were the sparks. The committee's earlier Tampa hearings had already laid out the pattern: unsolved killings, missing police files, and a culture where 96 gambling arrests in 8 months produced no jail time. That wasn't an accident. It was how the market was built. If you wanted to run numbers without heat, Tampa was your lab. If you wanted to learn how to do it quietly and profitably, you watched the Trafficantes. This is where Santo Trafficante Jr. matters. The report's New York-Chicago focus, Costello and Lansky in the east, Accardo and Guzik in the Midwest, didn't ignore the southern line. It assumed it. Tampa's operation fed on interstate commerce and political cover the same way the big syndicates did, and Santo Jr. learned to use the national rules to protect a local empire. You don't survive bolita wars, assassinations, and a Senate spotlight by accident. You do it by staying off stage, letting other names catch the light while you bank respect and favors. Down in Tallahassee, 3 weeks later, the Haley Committee, the House's little Kefauver, prepared its own report. Time was short, the mandate cramped, but the targets were specific. The State Racing Commission's quiet readmission of known bookmakers to Miami tracks, the question of hidden racetrack ownership by a former Capone ally alongside Bill Johnston, a top donor to Governor Fuller Warren, the governor's curious reinstatement of Smiling Jimmy Sullivan in Dade County. Witnesses lined up, the Miami Crime Commission accusing Warren, Hillsborough's Ralph Mills walking legislators through Tampa's murder record and Sheriff Hugh Culbraith's wealth, racing commissioners fumbling over fat expense accounts and thin explanations. The committee's posture was plain: friendly to the governor, skeptical of Miami's reformers, hostile once the racing commissioners ran out of answers. One bartender, Grady McWhorter, claimed he worked both sides of the street: Sheriff Sullivan, the Miami Crime Commission, and top gambler Raymond Craig, and tossed in a story about an envelope handed to the commission's president. The committee ran out of time before hearing the hotel man, who denied it. The record kept the denial. The envelope's contents, if it ever existed, stayed a rumor. What the Haley Group didn't do was just as telling. They didn't subpoena the top gamblers, the Tampa syndicates Red Italiano and the Trafficantes, or the Miami S&G bosses, or the Panhandle bookmakers. Craig was invited, not dragged. With only weeks to work while session ran, House investigators poked holes and found smoke, then rushed to put a bow on it. The message to anyone watching from Tampa was simple. The state could make noise, but only Washington had a plan to change the odds. Through it all, the center holds. Santo Jr. in a world where the rules are being redrafted in real time. The Senate wants tighter books, stronger subpoenas, and clean records. Santo runs an enterprise built on cash, silence, and distance. The feds want to strangle the wire. Santo's people already know how to live without a paper trail. State committees urge grand juries and citizens' commissions. Santo knows grand juries leak and citizens' commissions age out. May 1951 didn't topple him. It rewrote the playbook around him. The big syndicates took the heat. The governors and ambassadors took the headlines. The telegraph companies took the blame. In Tampa, the murders stayed unsolved, the files stayed thin, and the bolita bankers kept breathing. The lesson for a patient boss was obvious. Keep the profile low, keep the alliances national, and let the reformers point at New York while you tighten your grip on Florida. That's how Santo Trafficante Jr. stepped into the decade, calm in the chaos, watching the country build a crime control machine he already knew how to beat. June 20th, 1951. Tampa was stripped to the studs. The Senate Crime Committee laid out a murder sheet, more than a dozen racket killings and 6 botched hits in under 20 years, and said what everybody in the back rooms already knew. The Mafia's shadow ran through the city's gamblers and the cops who looked the other way. Bolita paid the freight. Bribes greased campaigns. Files disappeared. Witnesses vanished. And when the committee moved to call names, the names, Sicilian and otherwise, were suddenly out of town. Santo Trafficante Sr. didn't sit for them. He'd been a power in Tampa for 2 decades, tied in the papers to national figures, and when West Coast boss Jack Dragner's effects were searched, the old man's number turned up in the notebook. The message was simple. Tampa wasn't a side hustle. It was plugged into the grid. Chief M.C. Beasley, new in the chair and honest enough to say what he saw, told the senators straight. There was a mafia, it had reach, and the shooters weren't local. Outsiders flew in, did the work, and left no one to finger. Meanwhile, the police department failed the basics. 96 gambling arrests in 8 months. No jail time. The only conviction anyone could remember was nearly 20 years old. Even the sheriff's books didn't add up. Hugh Culbraith's net worth climbed from roughly 30 grand to over 100 while he wore the badge, and a grand jury later hit him for bribes and misconduct. He said it was legitimate. The committee didn't buy the arithmetic. They also couldn't get past the allegation that bookmaking ran inside his jail. This is how the Trafficantes learned to breathe in public. Bolita funded the city. Politics protected the bolita. Violence kept disputes quiet, and the men at the center stayed off stage. When the feds came to peel it back, the core remained out of reach. That was lesson 1 for Santo Jr. Stay 2 rooms away from the blood and 1 step ahead of the law. The next day, the committee widened the lens. Cleveland. Once Elliot Ness and Judge, later Governor, Frank Lauscher, closed the big rooms in the city, the syndicate spread to the softer counties, Geauga, Lake, Trumbull, Lawrence. When that got tight, they crossed the river into the wide-open counties of northern Kentucky, Campbell and Kenton, where a police chief could pretend not to see a casino everyone else could find by taxi. The money got so strong it helped finish the Desert Inn in Vegas, and it all ran on the same formula. Tampa understood local law looking away, wire service carrying the action, skim off the top, before an accountant like Alvin Geesey turned the lies into tax returns. Detroit came next, June 22nd. The committee walked the floor of a motor plant and showed how gambling burrowed into American industry. Numbers writers used storerooms as cages, parts counters taking bets, crane operators lowering buckets for wagers, three-man chains moving slips and cash so nobody ever had both on them at a rest, gang money leaning into union elections to keep the doors open. The fines were a business expense paid by bosses, not runners. The committee's fix: labor and management stop pointing fingers and write a rule. Get caught gambling on company time and you're out. It was a bandage on an artery. Then Louisiana. New Orleans had a lineage. Huey Long welcomed Frank Costello's slot machines when New York bounced them. Phil Castile helped run the business. When Mayor de Lesseps Morrison took office in '46, the outfit retreated to Jefferson and St. Bernard parishes and left the city as a warehouse, until cops seized and destroyed hundreds of machines, and a court said a mint dispenser is still a slot if it pays. Outside the city, the machines sat everywhere, in diners, barbershops, filling stations, while sheriffs low-balled the numbers and ministers told the truth. The wire service ran hot there too. Continental Press, then the Chicago crowd muscling in with Trans-American until they merged, and the outfit held the bigger piece. Narcotics moved in the open spaces. Heroin from New York, marijuana through Texas. A narcotics agent laid it out. Any parish that tolerated gambling and prostitution was a perfect field for dope. Protection money flowed weekly. A cop's ex-wife testified to cash and groceries left on Saturdays. Marshals in small towns confirmed the pattern. The owners of the biggest club in Jefferson, Forest, stayed underground, while witnesses described a casino that worked like a factory. Dice day and night. A half-dozen roulette wheels on a busy evening. Blackjack, football pools, race books, a wall of slots, loans on jewelry when the cash ran out. Free drinks, always. The wire in the back. June 23rd brought a sideshow with teeth. In Miami, former publisher Harry Voiler battled the ex-wife of Martin Accardo, Tony Accardo's brother, over whether outfit money bankrolled his doomed paper. She said 100 grand, in chunks, 30, 20, 15, and that a lawyer saw some of it. He said not a nickel, and played the First Amendment on why he'd run a Welcome Mr. Costello editorial. She swore he'd lined up a meeting with Frank Costello. He swore he'd never met the man. The senators smelled perjury and promised to pass it to the U.S. attorney. Even in the theater, the point held, newspapers, politics and syndicate cash shared a table when the odds were right. Thread it back to Tampa and it reads the same. Wire services power bookmaking, missing files protect killers, county lines and state borders give cover, accountants wash revenue, sheriffs grow rich on public salaries. The names change. Costello in New York, Accardo in Chicago, Castile in New Orleans, but the structure doesn't. And in that structure, Santo Trafficante Jr. grows from the quiet son to the quiet boss. By the time Washington finished its June run, the committee had proved the pattern from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Gambling is the spine, politics the armor, bloodstream, and fear the silencer. Tampa wasn't an outlier. It was a model. Which is why Santo Jr. didn't need to grandstand or swing at headlines. He watched the hearings, counted the recommendations, and adjusted the angles. Less paper, tighter crews, business handled one circle, deeper from the street. The Senate could write 39 fixes and indict half a dozen sheriffs. It could throw light on Cleveland's hedge, Detroit's shop floors, New Orleans' casino rows. But the way to survive, Santo Jr.'s way, was unchanged. Never be the man in the room when the room gets raided. Never leave both the money and the bets in the same hands. Pay who needs paying. Disappear when the subpoenas land. And let other cities draw the fire, while Tampa keeps the bank rolling. June 23rd, 1951. The show moved fast and mean. In Miami, the Senate crime hearing staged a split screen the papers couldn't resist former Miami Beach publisher Harry Voiler on one side, the blonde ex-wife of Martin Accardo, Tony Accardo's brother, on the other. She said outfit cash bankrolled Voiler's dying daily, 100 grand paid in chunks, 30, 20, 15. She said a Miami lawyer saw the money. Voiler called it fiction. Not a nickel, he swore. The Welcome Mr. Costello editorial, just a civil liberties sermon, tongue-in-cheek. She said he lined up a meeting with Frank Costello. He said he never met him. Senator Herbert O'Connor didn't play umpire. He flagged perjury and said he'd ship it to the U.S. attorney. Even as theatre, the point landed. Newspapers, gamblers, and syndicate money sat closer than they admitted. Then O'Connor did something no chairman had done. He subpoenaed a sitting governor. Fuller Warren of Florida, who'd answered questions by telegram and ducked every invitation, was ordered to appear in Washington on July 9th. The 6 questions were blunt. Who financed his 1948 race? Any promises to tolerate gambling? Any deals on the bookie wire? What he knew about rackets leaning on Florida lawmen, and whether out-of-state gangsters were parked in legitimate businesses. Warren's telegram denied everything. No gangster money, no commitments, no arrangements, no knowledge. He cited an anti-bookie bill he'd helped pass in '49 and suspensions of 9 officers for ignoring gambling laws. O'Connor read the subpoena anyway. The Miami courtroom jumped, reporters bolted for phones, the crowd clapped, and the cameras drank it in. Warren had just tried to muddy the reformers, accusing Miami Crime Commission President Jack Younger of taking a fat brown envelope at the McAllister Hotel and keeping gambler company. Younger shot back, "I've already testified under oath. The governor's hiding from the committee and lying about me." The message underneath was plainer. Tallahassee politics were now part of the case file. Back on the Tampa front, the committee finally got a live one. Angel Daniel, a grey-suited bolita banker who said little and admitted less. He'd been born in Key West in 1888, lived in Tampa since 1900, baptized Catholic. He volunteered those basics and almost nothing else. When the Senate was in Tampa the previous December, he said he was in Baltimore with a sick wife at Johns Hopkins. Royal something or other became the Mount Royal Apartments when pressed. No, he hadn't told anyone where he was. After Baltimore, he went to Jacksonville, read he'd been subpoenaed, and only then reported to the marshal after the committee had left. Daniel said he left Bolita in July 1950 and hadn't earned anything since, except $1,500 playing the dogs in St. Pete. He brought money, order stubs, for tax payments, but no returns. Why money orders? I thought they required cash. He said he handled business by checks, cash, both, mostly out of his house. He'd once had a place on Spring Street, closed after 1940. He admitted owning some government bonds, but didn't know what they were worth. In his 1950 return, he'd written Games of Chance under occupation. The committee pushed on the $12,000 loan to Tony Italiano, son of Salvatore Red Italiano. No collateral beyond a 6% note, 90 days, extended on request. The note wasn't Tony's signature. It was Vincent Spoto's, president of Anthony Distributors, the Italiano family's wholesale beer and wine company. Daniel said he handed the cash to Tony. Did any of them go to Red? He couldn't say. Had Red called him since coming back from Italy? He might have called a couple of times. Did Daniel talk to syndicate boys about his subpoena? He claimed not to know what that meant. He knew Primo Lazzara, Gus Frisia, and Santo Trafficante, but couldn't say their business. Bolita numbers came off New York bond figures in the papers, or from throwing cards, a job handled by an old man named Tito at rotating spots. Tito wasn't his man, Daniel said, and he didn't know who paid him. Arrest history. Maybe a ticket, maybe a night in jail. Nothing more. The answers were low monotone and non-committal. The profile was classic: cash, distance, and a paper trail thin enough to blow away. The broader Tampa picture had already been nailed down on June 20th. More than a dozen racket murders and 6 attempted hits in under 20 years. Almost no convictions. Files missing or never made. Gambling protected by payoffs. The Mafia's shadow everywhere and nowhere. Chief Beasley said out loud what the city whispered. Yes, there's a Mafia. The shooters weren't hometown. They flew in, did the work, flew out. Sheriff Hugh Melonhead Culbreth, so nicknamed by Cuban gamblers, took an indictment for bribes and misconduct. He couldn't satisfy the committee how his net worth jumped from about $30,000 to more than $100,000 as sheriff. There were allegations of bookmaking inside his own jail, and when West Coast boss Jack Dragner's belongings were searched, Santo Trafficante Sr.'s number turned up. One more line showing Tampa plugged into the national board. Kefauver himself later summed it up. Tampa was a sub-capital in the Mafia-backed narcotics traffic. The city sat on an interstate web: Miami, New Orleans, Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, even Havana, bound by gambling, dope, and hired guns. Locally, the rival factions, Italian Mafia on one side, the larger Cuban crowd on the other, kept the temperature high while parts of law enforcement looked away. When the committee came hunting mafiosi, the suspects disappeared and stayed gone, waiting out the clock. Red Italiano was one pillar of that world. Culbreth was the other. So the senators pulled on the corporate thread. Spoto, president of Anthony Distributors, drew $100 a week for working shipping. Red had been general manager at $300 until, according to Spoto, he resigned by letter just before the Tampa hearings. His son Tony took over at $250 a week. After staff read Red's record, including Atlanta time for prohibition violations, counsel asked the obvious: how does a man with that history run a licensed outfit? Santo Trafficante Jr. isn't the loudest name in this day's testimony, but he's the gravity. Daniel knows him. The Italians and Cubans measure moves against him. The subpoenas scatter when his circle is threatened. The city's mechanics, bolita bankers, peddlers, card throwers, beer distributor fronts, cash loans inside the family, are the bloodstream he inherits and perfects. Washington can subpoena a governor and threaten perjury. Miami can televise a showdown. Tampa can produce a careful banker who turns big money into money orders and shrugs at memory. Through it, Santo Jr. keeps the discipline. Don't argue in public, don't sign what you can avoid, and when the room fills with noise, wait it out. When it empties, decide what happens next. June 26, 1951, the Tampa story stopped being rumor and turned into arithmetic. A former bolita peddler named Paul Giglia took the chair and put Hillsborough County Sheriff Hugh Culbreth on a pay sheet. During the 1948 re-election push, Giglia said his boss, gambling fixer Jimmy Velasco, told him to take some money down to the sheriff. First delivery, $500 in cash. Culbreth's reply, according to Giglia, it comes in handy. A week later, $1,000 more. Giglia said Velasco sent regular money to the old man, Culbreth rent, as they called it, because protection was never free and never final. The committee stacked witnesses. Velasco's cousin, Antonio Deschamps, said Cuban bolita men called the sheriff Cabeza de Melon, Melon Head, and that Velasco kept a payoff list. $500 weekly to Cabeza de Melon, $500 to R, $250 to ED. Deschamps said R was State Attorney J. Rex Farrier, ED was former Police Chief Eddings. Mario Lounders and Oscar Perez backed the pattern. Perez drove Velasco to the county jail, where the gambler would meet the sheriff in an inner room they called the rat hole. Amounts varied, Perez said, because even payoffs have to balance a budget. Farrier came to Washington and denied it all. Edding stayed home. Culbreath faced the committee in Tampa and again in Washington and said he took no graft, though he remembered an envelope from Giglia and couldn't say if it held $1 or 500. On the stand he played the part of the simple lawman. I am not a smart boy and never was, but the numbers said otherwise. Associate Counsel Downey Rice walked him, slowly, through 9 years of income and assets like a branding. Culbreath claimed he'd started his sheriff's term in 1941 with $27,000 cash. The committee's math showed net income of $36,000.14 from 1941 to 1949. That should total roughly $63,000.14. Yet the asset list, cash, bonds, property, came to $95,893.52. At least $128,000 had moved through 5 bank accounts in 9 years. $45,700 sat in accounts, a safe deposit box, and a home safe when they counted. Another $6,500 in government bonds. This on a $7,500 salary with a family to feed. The sheriff's memory for addresses was poor. His memory for deposits was worse. Then came the punchline with teeth. 2 former insiders said the sheriff's brother, Ernest Rookie Culbreath, the chief criminal deputy, ran a book out of the county jail with another deputy, Leslie Cathcart. They called it Briggs and Company. The sheriff waved it off as jokes between friends. Rookie was almost blind, he said, and needed the laughs. Rice produced a matchbook. Briggs and Company, Rookie Culbreath and Leslie Cathcart. We do small things big. Everything in sports. The sheriff said someone was playing a trick. The committee's file filled with more than jokes. Culbreath's backstory didn't help. A 1938 grand jury once indicted 9 officials, including then Constable Culbreath, alongside 7 of Tampa's top gamblers, and asked the governor to remove him. Nothing happened. He admitted running a private fishing business as constable and filing no income tax returns on those earnings. He thought public officials were exempt. The taxmen weren't amused. After the hearings, the Bureau made him go back and file 9 years of amended returns with penalties and interest. In March 1951, a grand jury indicted him for taking protection money and for neglect of duty, including failing to stop Briggs and Company from operating a lottery out of his own office. He was suspended. In May, after legal maneuvers clipped most counts, a local jury acquitted him on the last one. Governor Fuller Warren reinstated him. Back in the chair, the sheriff called himself Exhibit A for how politicians get abused by malcontents and has-beens. The committee called him a man whose explanations didn't balance. What did balance was Tampa's structure. Velasco pays, peddlers collect, money moves to lawmen, files go thin, murders stay unsolved, and the city's most durable businesses, bolita and silence, keep the lights on. When Estes Kefauver wrote it up in the Daily News a month later, he tied off the lesson. If decent citizens look away because they like the product, law enforcement and honesty go to hell in a handcart. In Tampa, the fallout finally sparked a counterweight. A Hillsborough County Crime Commission, with Miami investigator Ralph W. Mills brought in to drive the cleanup. Through all of it, the Trafficante machine kept its shape. Santo Sr. stayed off the witness list and out of reach. The family's name surfaced in the margins of loans, distributors, and introductions, but never where the money met the raid. That discipline is what Santo Trafficante Jr. inherited. The committee could expose Melonhead's bank balances and the jailhouse book. It could rattle Tallahassee and slap subpoenas on a governor. But the man who would matter most in Tampa's next chapter already knew the rule that Culbreth forgot when the heat comes. Don't be the story. Own the room that writes it. July 26, 1952, the Tribune laid out how deep and wide bolita still ran in Florida, Tampa fingerprints all over it. Deputies hit a roadside cabin west of Lakeland and found the week's bolita books, Havana radio waiting to announce the winning number, and two men at the desk, Philip M. Lino, 51, Tampa, bartender at the Nebraska bar, licensed under Santo Trafficante. Lino admitted he once worked for Anthony Distributors, the Italiano family's beer and wine firm. He said he brought $2,000 from Tampa to pay winners. Frank Duskin, 47, Winter Park, once sold mercantile goods in Polk County, but was now running numbers. Records seized showed a 3-week run of business. Week 1, 34 peddlers, $2,912.10 in play, $1,109.50 paid out, net $1,196.80. Week 2, 32 peddlers, $2,454.45 in play, $570.50 paid, net $1,810.30. Week 3, 35 peddlers, $2,580.85 in play, $2,750 paid, net loss $246.55, too many winners. The papers listed 42 sellers across Polk towns, Lakeland, Bartow, Auburndale, Mulberry, Nichols, Brewster, with a few in Kissimmee and Sarasota. Missing, Lake Wales, Winter Haven, evidence of divided territories. The setup suggested Tampa money, Orlando logistics, Polk foot soldiers. A Tampa bondsman quickly covered their $6,000 bail. The same day, Assistant Attorney General James Toney led raids in the Glades. Stacy Reedon Cafe, $1,022 in cash, stacks of bolita slips, arrests of Bessie Mitchell and her son. Greenleaf Beer Garden, $782 and tickets seized. Samuel Pompey, Sr. and Jr. arrested. Club Savoy near Pahokee, run by Mirabella, also raided. A fourth spot near South Bay completed the sweep. Over $20,000 seized, one of the biggest Glades hauls in years. Meanwhile, staff writer Ellis Clifton revealed why Tampa's gamblers thrived. The City Police Record Bureau didn't fingerprint misdemeanor arrests. Gamblers and small-time hoods could bond out, pay fines, and walk, often under false names. Only stockade sentences triggered prints. Chief M.C. Beasley admitted it was a budget problem. The loophole meant even an escaped killer could blend into the misdemeanor churn without being identified. Put together, July 1952 showed the two faces of Florida's gambling world. Syndicate scale, Tampa licensed bars and Italiano-linked firms feeding cash and men into Polk County and beyond. Street-level action, cafes, beer gardens, and clubs in black and white neighborhoods of Pahokee, with tens of thousands moving weekly. Official gaps. A city police system too underfunded or too comfortable to build the paper trail that could connect arrests to syndicates. And always in the background, the names that mattered most, Trafficante, Italiano, surfacing in liquor licenses, past employment, and bondsmen, but never at the cabin table when the radio from Havana called the winning number. Federal heat was closing in, and Tampa was the target. By 1963, Santo Trafficante Jr.'s syndicate, the quiet but powerful machine behind Florida's gambling rackets, was under direct assault. The government had decided to go after the numbers men, the street-level operators who made bolita work, and squeeze them until someone broke. The arrests came one after another. Manuel Fernandez, a grocer from North Boulevard. Theo John Lelekis, a former sponge diver turned bartender at the Trafficantes Tangerine Tavern. Travis Bowen, a Winter Haven fruit dealer. They were Cuba pickup men, bag carriers in the racket, trusted enough to handle tickets and money. Along with Henry Barnhill, another pickup man, they'd been caught at a Waverly cabin with nearly $6,000 in bolita slips. Fernandez had been driving. Lelekis was riding shotgun. Deputies chased them through the flat woods before bringing them in. Lelekis made bond and told reporters he'd never been arrested in his life. He claimed to be a working man, just another bartender. But the tavern where he poured drinks was owned by the Trafficante family. And everyone in Tampa knew what business that meant. Federal agents didn't care whether he smiled for the cameras or threatened to smash them. They had him on paper. Failure to register for the federal gambling tax, the new weapon in Washington's war on the mob. Philip Lino, another Trafficante employee, was picked up in the same sweep. Like the others, he faced both state and federal charges. Polk County deputies had him pegged as a payoff man in the Cuba racket, shuttling envelopes between the bosses and their peddlers. The message from the government was clear. Nobody, from the bartenders to the bagmen, would be spared. But Santo himself never saw the inside of a holding cell. He stayed insulated, just as he always had, while his lieutenants carried the weight. The following year, the feds turned up the pressure with tax liens, dropping them like bombs across Florida. The biggest hit was Harlan Blackburn, a one-time Tampa resident who turned Orlando bolita kingpin. The IRS claimed he owed $128,000 in back taxes, money earned in the same racket Trafficante controlled. Blackburn, who sometimes called himself Sammy Davis, was said to have operations stretching from Tampa to Georgia. Others were hit too. Condor Merritt, the Seminole County gambler with real political clout in the black community, and Harvey Vieno of Austin. Merritt kept his federal gambling stamp up to date, but that didn't stop Treasury agents from targeting him. Vieno, already tied to lottery cases in Sanford, was assessed for $126,000. Together, the liens totaled $334,000, a staggering figure that underscored how much cash bolita pumped through Florida. The raids that followed were some of the biggest in years. They stretched across Hillsborough, Orange, and Polk counties. In Polk, deputies stormed a payoff station near Lakeland, catching Lino again, this time with Frank Duskin, a Winter Park preacher turned gambler. Duskin, a born showman, pleaded in open court for his fellow defendants to fly straight. Nobody took him seriously. In Tampa, Sheriff-elect Ed Blackburn Jr., working with deputies, and the Hillsborough County Crime Commission grabbed Sam Cagnina, a known Trafficante associate, at Pete's truck stop on East Hillsborough Avenue. Cagnina was caught red-handed taking lottery tickets from a pickup man named Lawrence Wall. Officers also found a slot machine in the back and arrested the station operator. Across Lakeland, Brewster, Nichols, Bradley and Mulberry, deputies swept through homes and cafes, kicking in doors, finding bolita slips hidden in tin cans, and dragging in wives, girlfriends and small-time peddlers. Sing Wall, Lawrence's wife, was arrested after deputies broke into her house and found cash and tickets under her bed. In Orlando, agents raided the home of Blackburn's associate, Norma Bridges, catching phone calls from customers looking for the day's number, even as officers stood inside. Both Blackburn and Bridges slipped away before the raid. The arrests were meant to send a message. But the structure of the Trafficante syndicate stayed intact. Every pickup man was replaceable. Every peddler could be swapped out. The money kept flowing up the ladder, and the man at the top, Santo Trafficante Jr., remained untouched. From Tampa bars like the Tangerine Tavern to backroad cabins in Polk County, from Orlando houses to Glades cafes, the racket was everywhere. What tied it all together was the network Trafficante inherited from his father, and tightened under his own watch. Every grocer, bartender, and ex-preacher caught in the net pointed back to him. Yet when the cameras rolled and the indictments came down, Santo wasn't in the room. The state was hunting Harlan Blackburn. They didn't find him. They found Santo Trafficante Jr. agents hit a house by the Hillsborough River, part of a 3-county dragnet for Blackburn, the Central Florida bolita boss, who kept popping up just long enough to say he wasn't missing and then vanish again. In the living room sat Trafficante, Tampa's quiet center of gravity, and a state road department man named Barrett W. Stevenson. Stevenson said he'd known Santo 20 years, sold him suits once. He made $350 a month as a road claims inspector and had just managed a losing sheriff's race. It looked bad. A state employee in a room with a gambler, while the Attorney General's office worked the phones hunting a fugitive. Road Chairman Alfred A. McKethan asked for a report. A week later, the department cleared Stevenson, called the meeting personal, and closed the book. Blackburn was still gone. The killings kept pressure high. 2 men, Rene Nunez and Angelo Giglio, went down in Tampa the Monday after Assistant Attorney General James B. Toney tore through Orlando, Polk, and Hillsborough. Inside Irvin's shop in Tallahassee, a theory formed fast. The Sicilian syndicate out of Tampa ran Blackburn's numbers in Polk. Nunez, a Cuban, pushed into that ground. Somebody decided he was tipping to lawman and moved him off the board. Same night, same city. 2 bodies. No answers from Tampa police. The raid that turned up Trafficante and Stevenson came out of a simple question. Who was arranging Blackburn's bond outside Polk? The agents followed a money trail and found the right living room, just not the right fugitive. The city's lines blurred, politics, law, and bolita, and every path still angled back to Santo. Ralph Mills didn't bother with angles. Running the Hillsborough County Crime Commission on a shoestring, he told the Exchange Club what they didn't want to hear. Trafficante's syndicate was grossing close to $1 million a year. Bolita wasn't the whole machine, but it was the engine. Mills said every organized racketeer in the county operated with official protection, that in more than 8 years, the mayor had never once called the rackets what they were, even after 6 gang murders in 5 years, and that Sheriff Hugh Culbreath's excuses were just that. He laid out the September 20th operation. 1,555 bettors, $2,432.95 wagered on the Cuban National Lottery in that slice alone, slack season, with the annual skim for that section running past $126,000. After overhead and protection, Santo cleared about $90,000 from that corner of the map. Add daily bolita and bond play, another $364,000, and the other table games the city politely ignored, and the take neared $1 million. Is it any wonder, Mills asked, that racketeers resort to murder to protect it? The paperwork backed him up. The same month, tax liens hammered bolita men across central Florida. The IRS posted $334,000 in claims, $128,000 on Harlan Blackburn of Orlando, $80,000 on Condor Merritt out of Seminole County, $126,000 on Harvey Vieno of Austin. Blackburn, a former Tampa hand who sometimes used Sammy Davis, ran action into Georgia. Merritt kept his federal gambling stamp current and still drew heat. He owned Club Eaton and votes in Altamonte Springs. Vieno had already surfaced in Sanford cases. The message matched Mills's math. The money was real. On the street, the bodies of the business were smaller. The men who ran tickets and counted cash took the charges and the chases. 2 of them, Philip M. Leno from Tampa and Frank Duskin, an ex-preacher from Winter Garden, were the face of the July Polk raid that set the fall in motion. Deputies caught them west of Lakeland in a cabin, waiting on Havana radio to call the number, with bolita slips and cash on the table. Leno had $2,000 on him. He was Trafficante's bartender at the Nebraska bar, 2901 Nebraska Avenue, and, according to deputies, a payoff man in the Cuba racket. Duskin was tied to Blackburn's Orlando side. Both refused to name bosses. Weeks later, a federal grand jury tagged Leno for failing to buy the gambling tax stamp. State court became their next move. In Bartow, their lawyer stood up and argued immunity, said the men had talked to Assistant County Solicitor William Love after arrest, and that a Florida Supreme Court ruling could block prosecution. Love answered, "No oath, no immunity. They'd been warned of their rights, nothing more." Judge Roy Amadon pushed the trial and took the motion under advisement. The charges, conspiracy and lottery violations, stood. Bond stayed at $3,000. Duskin, now cooperating, sat in protective custody and preached from a defense table. "Children, we have all violated the laws. Let's tell the truth." It didn't change the arithmetic. The same arithmetic ran through the September 20th sweep Mills loved to point to. Deputies and Winter Haven JCs working as special officers hit Lakeland, Brewster, Nichols, Bradley, Mulberry. In Tampa, Sheriff-elect Ed Blackburn Jr. Deputy Constable Jimmy Hackney and Mills himself watched from a car at Pete's truck stop, 2603 East Hillsborough. They saw a pickup man from Lakeland, Lawrence Wall, hand bolita tickets to Sam Cagnina. They arrested both. Inside, they found a slot machine and hauled the operator, Peter Tagliarini, for possession of gambling equipment. In Lakeland, deputies broke a window at the Wall House and pulled 2 rolls of Cuba tickets marked 3 and more than $200 from a tin can under a bed. They arrested Wall's wife, Singh. In Orlando, Tony and Sheriff Dave Starr kicked in the door at a house used by Blackburn and his girlfriend, Norma Bridges. She wasn't home. Neither was he. Agents answered phones ringing with customers asking for the day's number. A statewide alert went out. The list of those hit that day ran long. Duskin, Cagnina, both Walls, Robert Bell, and a line of names out of Lakeland, Brewster, Bradley, Mulberry, Nichols. Back in Tallahassee, the harm was as much political as criminal. The search that turned up Trafficante and Stevenson was designed to map Blackburn's bail, but it sketched something else. A network where a road inspector could sit with the city's most careful gangster while the state looked for a killer numbers man. McKethan's investigation called Stevenson's contact personal, and Chief Road Attorney John McWhirter said he was convinced it wasn't criminal. On paper, the department was clean. In practice, the line between public salary and private power stayed thin. Attorney General Richard Irvin drew his conclusion straight. Lax law enforcement let gambling profits pile up. Profits brought competition. Competition brought murder. The staff's working theory named the pieces: Sicilian control out of Tampa, Blackburn in Polk, Nunez pushing his Cuban network into that lane, and somebody deciding to erase a rival and a suspected tipster in a single night. 18 arrests in the raids that week proved they could grab runners and writers. They still couldn't put cuffs on the man who mattered. That was the pattern. When the doors came down, agents found bartenders on Trafficantes' payroll, bondsmen, pickup crews, and ex-preachers with sermons about flying straight. They found phones ringing with customers asking for numbers and wives sitting on cans of tickets. They filed liens, seized slips, and argued over immunity. They did not find Santo Trafficante Jr. in a back room with ledgers. He didn't need ledgers. He needed silence, distance, and people who would stand still when the flashbulbs popped. The city learned what Mills already knew. The syndicate was built to survive a raid. Every peddler could be replaced by nightfall. Every check-in cabin could move a mile down the road. The only constant was the man who never argued in public and never let himself be the story. While Tallahassee cleared its employee and Bartow postponed its trial, Santo stayed where he belonged, in the quiet, while the business carried on under his name.